Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. Tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming John Pendlebury from Newcastle to speak to us. Jessica Soule, my wife, and I first met John when we were at XJTLU in Suzhou, China. And Professor Pendlebury was our external reviewer, so coming from Newcastle to, I guess, essentially like accreditation for what Liverpool was doing in China. And I don't know how long ago that was, but probably 10 years, something like that. So it's wonderful to finally be able to bring him here. And he's been here for 5 or 6 days, worked with a couple classes, met with various students for advising, got some tourism in the area, etc. So we've had a nice extended visit here over the last few days. So my name is Andrew Johnston. I'm the director of the program in historic preservation. And tonight's lecture is supported by the Kelly Tuckey Endowment for Historic Preservation. So this evening we welcome John Pendlebury, Professor of Urban Conservation at the Newcastle University School of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape. He teaches and researches on issues of heritage, conservation, development, planning, and governance. He focuses on the interface between contemporary cultural heritage policy and other policy processes, as well as undertaking more historical work on how conceptions of heritage have been balanced with modernizing forces. Pendlebury's principal publications include Conservation in the Age of Consensus and the edited collections Valuing Historic Environments from 2009 and Alternative Visions of Post-War Reconstruction, Creating the Modern Townscape from 2015. His most recent book with Jules Brown is Conserving the Historic Environment from 2021. His current interests include adaptive reuse, industrial heritage, and the conservation of the buildings of the welfare state. So join me in welcoming John.
Thank you. My first task is to see if I can switch the microphone on. Is that working? Is the microphone working? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I was once in Charlottesville, I think it was 27 years ago, so it's been a while, but it's been a great trip. The weather's been fantastic, so thank you, Andrew, for organising that. That's super considerate of you. And I've talked about World Heritage Sites quite often in my time, but rarely so adjacent to one as we're doing tonight. So it's kind of quite nice to be talking about World Heritage Sites while standing very close to one. But I'm not here to talk about Monticello. I'm not here to talk about UVA. I'm not here to talk about Thomas Jefferson. I know there's others much better qualified than me in this room who are able to do that. My task tonight is to talk about World Heritage Sites in the UK, and specifically talk about World Heritage Sites that are either our cities or are located within cities. In the background here, in the foreground here, we have Greenwich in London, a view from Greenwich Hill, part of the Maritime Greenwich World Heritage Site. It's a World Heritage Site with some important architecture, as you can get a hint of here, and some kind of world-defining scientific developments, really, particularly related to ocean navigation and leading to, for example, the establishment of the Greenwich Meridian, the establishment of Greenwich Mean Time and so on, and a nice observatory, Andrew, with some telescopes and so on you can go and look at next time you're there. But of course, that's not all we see. We also see in the background London Docklands, the Isle of Dogs, Canary Wharf, the sort of big financial district which has grown up since the 1980s. And for better or for worse, it really affects our experience of being on Greenwich Hill. The view is completely different now than it's been for most of that history until I guess, until the 1980s, these buildings started springing up. Some people like it, some people hate it, but it's undoubtedly true, it's different. Now, with an eye on the time, one of my key tasks tonight is not to digress too much. There's a few digressions, but this is quite an important one, I think. I think it's important to give you some context in understanding a little bit about how British planning works. And I might add more specifically how English planning works, because the planning system is a little bit different in the different constituent nations of the United Kingdom, so between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Not much difference, but a little bit different, and administered within each of those nations. World Heritage Sites, of course, are at a nation-state level and transcend that, but a lot of the local management occurs within these four nations. I think probably the thing to really emphasise, particularly being here in a different country in the US, is that planning is a comprehensive activity. It's been a comprehensive activity since the 1940s. In the 1940s, effectively the right to develop land was nationalised. And as part of that process, as part of that kind of creation of the modern planning system, heritage protection was introduced and integrated into that system. Now, initially, having been integrated into that system, heritage protection was a marginal planning objective. But in common with many countries, heritage protection became a markedly more important policy goal during the 1960s, a little bit, but particularly during the 1970s. And in England, it consolidated that position as an important policy objective with a kind of strong legal framework, a strong policy framework in the 1980s and 1990s. But alongside that, the kind of act of conservation was increasingly aligned and seen as a means of achieving other policy goals, particularly around economic regeneration. And that's a kind of key issue which I'll come back to a few times, I think. A few other kind of things to pick up. I think there's always been complaints that this is not a very well resourced system, but there's been a demonstrable fall in resource in terms of staff, in terms of money, since the mid-2000s, but particularly really since 2000, after 2010, and the kind of austerity period for public sector finances which followed that date. So the net result is we have a system of heritage protection that's grown incrementally over time with very little reference to international standards or practice, and that's a little bit relevant when we kind of come on to talk about World Heritage Sites. But to really emphasise, this is a very strong legal framework in principle with very strong policy attached to it. So to just give you a little flavour of that, if your building is listed, if it has heritage listing in the UK, that means you do require consent, you require government consent to change that building in a way which would affect its architectural quality, but also absolutely you would need consent, which is rarely given for demolition. And that kind of stands in contrast, I know, to the situation here. So it's important to have some kind of understanding there. It's a very extensive system. I mean, something like 500,000 listed buildings in England alone, and add in the other nations on top of that. Something like 10,000 historic areas. So it's a very extensive system, but not well resourced. And it's been increasingly expected that this system support other policy goals, particularly economic ones. So to talk a little bit more about the relationship with regeneration, there's been a kind of process by which these have increasingly been presented as kind of complementary objectives. Protecting the heritage is good for economic regeneration. Economic regeneration is compatible with the kind of policy of retaining and sustaining and reusing heritage buildings. So this is a sort of a relationship which is quite complex. It's developed over time. It's really been developing, I guess, since the 1970s. It sort of kind of comes into kind of conversation. And it's to do with a whole series of different shifts. It's to do with a kind of response to 1960s redevelopment and an opposition to the kind of comprehensive redevelopments which were occurring at that time. It's so it's a kind of government response and acknowledgement to that. It's a response of the real estate market, which realised actually money is to be made out of reconditioning historic buildings, and the only way to make money isn't new construction. And it's also been fed a little bit by the kind of by a tactical response of people working within the heritage sector, arguing the kind of case to anybody who'll listen about how this is a policy, how this is an activity which helps and supports other desirable outcomes. It's not just kind of protecting these nice old buildings for their own sake. So just some examples very quickly of this process. Some of you might recognise this Covent Garden in the centre of London. Now, Covent Garden is a kind of key case really in this journey. So in the early 1970s, the municipal authorities in London wanted to have a kind of complete comprehensive redevelopment of this area of central London. The market, its historic use as a wholesale vegetable market had ceased. So we want to regenerate the area. So what do? We kind of raise the area and we build something new. There was a lot of opposition to that, both from heritage people, but also from small businesses in the area, from residents in the area. And they were successful in the sense that they persuaded the national government to heritage list several hundred buildings in that area, which effectively kind of killed the redevelopment plans of the local authority, of the Greater London Council, as it was. So the Greater London Council went away, kind of came back with a different set of proposals, reusing the buildings, more a conservation-based approach. And this was very quickly very successful, because developers realized there was actually a lot of money to be made through this approach as well. And if you go to Covent Garden today, it is basically the #1 kind of tourist destination in London. It has been so successful. And I mean, there's an irony here, of course, because a lot of the people protesting this project, in terms of residents and small businesses, were displaced and pushed out anyway, because the land values went up and gentrification occurred. Conservationists don't mind so much because the buildings were retained, but the kind of character and the function of the area changed within this kind of retained framework of a built environment. This perhaps I'll skip over because I'll come back a little bit later on to this. This is Liverpool, and this is the Albert Dock and the so-called Three Graces behind. But this is a kind of key example of sort of 1980s kind of government-sponsored regeneration in this sort of way, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, so I'll come back to that. And this is my home city of Newcastle. This is a project called the Grangetown project from the 1990s, early 2000s. And this, the point here is, I suppose, that by this point, this sort of policy of seeing the use of heritage as a way to achieve regeneration objectives had really been mainstreamed. And this is kind of government mainstream funding resources to help kind of lift economic activity and kind of quality of the environment in the centre of Newcastle, seeking to kind of purposefully and actively engage with the historic character of that city, and do so in a kind of way which is beneficial to putting that heritage in better order, but also achieving these goals of regeneration. Yeah, so just perhaps the last point to make before moving on is I said that I think a lot of this initially, in terms of those people who worked in conservation, those people who worked in heritage agencies, was a tactical response in terms of, we need to present our case, we need to argue our corner to people who are maybe not that sympathetic to us. But I think something which I'll kind of come back to is I think that thinking has gone from being a kind of tactical response to being quite institutionalized in the sector. And that's, a change I think I've observed in my working lifetime. Right, just finally on this theme, so English heritage, now confusingly really changed its name to Historic England, they've had an intermittent campaign for 20 years called Constructive Conservation. And what constructive conservation is all about is designed to make the development industry feel comfortable with working with Historic England. It's typically taken the form of glossy documents like this one, and these contain case studies showing, yes, here's another great case of how a policy of conservation can work with achieving a sort of economic outcome. So this is the first of those publications, Capital Solutions. It's kind of riffing on the name Capital here. It's Capital because it's a series of London-based cases, so the capital in that sense, capital in the sense of these are great solutions. Now, the point I want to make here is the very first case in this first publication in this sort of intermittent but long-running series is about a place called Sadler's Wells Theatre. And in this case, English Heritage, as it was, allowed the demolition of that building and a new building to be built. So they start off this series of publications with these words: sometimes demolition is the best solution. Now, I think that's a pretty extraordinary starting place for the National Cultural Agency to start a campaign, is to say sometimes demolition is the best solution. And I think that gives you some sense of the sort of anxieties which exist around this issue, and how this kind of key agency, National Cultural Agency, advising government, has sought to position itself. Right. Swerve back to World Heritage Sites. So this is just a little primer on World Heritage Sites. For those who you don't know, they're introduced in 1970. The World Heritage Convention introduced the idea in 1972. The first World Heritage Sites were inscribed in 1978, initially just a small number, 12. You can see the numbers have radically grown. You can see that most countries in the world are participants in this process, 168 out of 195. Considered to be outstanding universal value, there can be, we most normally perhaps think of cultural World Heritage Sites, and that's what I'm talking about tonight, but they can be natural World Heritage Sites, and indeed they can be combine the two characteristics. They have to meet criteria to be inscribed as World Heritage Sites, and have proved very popular, and such that there's a sort of demand management, and countries in the likes of mine and other European countries have been limited to making one application per annum because of just the sheer pressure of growth and the kind of wish for countries to get more and more World Heritage inscribed. In the background, we see the Taj Mahal here. I put the Taj Mahal in because if you see any press story in the UK about World Heritage Sites, the reference is always to say, like the Taj Mahal or like the Great Wall of China. It's the kind of key cultural reference points people, or perhaps I should say lazy journalists, have in their head when they think about World Heritage Sites. So this is what we have in the UK. Now, the UK is blown quite hot and cold about its involvement in UNESCO, as indeed I think the US has. So unlike most European countries, it was quite slow to engage, and there was a definite period of quite overt hostility towards UNESCO during the Thatcher administrations. But this is where we stand. 26 World Cultural Heritage Sites on the mainland of UK, albeit one is kind of there twice. Some on dependent territories, little specks of rock in the middle of the ocean, mostly. We've got a couple of natural sites as well. UNESCO is quite keen on transnational nominations these days, sites which span more than one country, and we're involved in a couple of those. Highlighted in red, we've got one deleted World Heritage Site, which makes us part of a very elite club, not one we perhaps wish to be a part of, but I'm going to spend a lot of time later on talking about Liverpool, which is the site which has been deleted. And then you see us against, you see the UK against some other European countries, and indeed the US. So you can see there's a lot of World Heritage Sites in France, even more in Germany, including one of the other ones to be deleted, even more in Italy, and not quite so many in the USA. But there was a definite kind of competition, I think, between those countries, France, Germany, Italy, who can have the most World Heritage Sites, which is part of the reason UNESCO introduced quality control. And just before I move on, in the background here, the way that UNESCO, this is taken from UNESCO's website, and the way they do that is the order in which they were listed. So the most recent World Heritage Site in the UK is the slate landscape of northwest Wales, which is huge industrial mining of Welsh slate for roofing principally, and that's what you see in the background image there. So a little bit more about cultural World Heritage Sites in the UK. This is really my effort to kind of roughly group those 26 World Heritage Sites. It's a bit of a mixture between a chronology and a more thematic approach. It's a bit crude. It doesn't really bear up to too much inspection, not least as many of these sites would span more than one category. So something like Edinburgh is in there under Enlightenment and Romantic, but it's got an older medieval part to it as well, which is an integral part of the World Heritage Site. But I do it really just to kind of give you a sense of the sort of flavour of the kind of cultural World Heritage Sites which exist in the UK. And you can see, and if we looked at the chronology, that's become over time weighted to more recent times. It's become weighted to particularly industrial sites and the role of the UK in the Industrial Revolution. With the exception of Ironbridge, these are all relatively recent inscriptions. And you can see also that, it moves forward and the agenda moves on into the 20th century. And here we have a nice big radio telescope. This is Jodrell Bank near where I grew up, which is now a World Heritage Site. Now, another short digression. About 20 years ago, I think, UNESCO and ICOMOS, who advise UNESCO, started worrying a bit more about World Heritage Sites which are cities or which are in cities, which is, of course, my theme tonight. I mean, this is really all to do with the sort of development pressure and the kind of big economic boom which was happening in a lot of cities in the world, and perhaps particularly in the West, in the early part of the century. I mean, which kind of had an unhappy ending in the 2008 crash, but at the time there was a kind of big boom going on. And ironically, perhaps in the wake of 9/11, a lot of that was for building tall buildings. Nobody had wanted to build tall buildings in the UK since the 1970s, but suddenly in the early 2000s, there's a big demand to build tall again. And that's not just the UK, it's certainly happening across Europe. So what that did was that it got people thinking about this and what the implications of that are for World Heritage Sites. So the World Heritage Centre undertook this report in 2006, World Heritage Cities Under Pressure. And it looked at 10 World Heritage Cities listed here. These weren't necessarily considered, they were just example case studies. So they weren't necessarily an attempt to say these are the 10 most endangered sites, but they were sample case studies where there were known to be significant development pressures, which it was thought should be looked at and understood as a kind of collective problem which had to be faced by kind of UNESCO in thinking about the future for these places. And you can see on there, there's a kind of couple of British ones. Tower of London, I'll talk very briefly about. Liverpool, which I'll talk at greater length about. In the background is Cologne, by the way, if you didn't spot it. Also, not long after this, we have the first ever deletion of a cultural World Heritage Site, which is the Dresden Elbe Valley, which was deleted in 2009. Actually, this wasn't deleted because of huge high-rise buildings or anything like that. It was deleted because of a new roadway outside the city, which was across a very kind of sensitive landscape approach to Dresden. And there's a big argument between UNESCO and the authorities in that part of Germany. And in the end, UNESCO decided to delete Dresden. So Dresden was the first cultural World Heritage Site to be deleted. Liverpool was the second, and so far, the only other one to lose that status. Now, I mean, UNESCO and ICOMOS had intermittently thought about the urban scale prior to this point. So you can go right back to the Nairobi Recommendation, 1976. You can go look at the Washington Charter from 1987. But it's fair to say it never really been at the foreground of UNESCO or ICOMOS thinking. But this kind of wave of pressure really began to kind of focus the mind a little bit. And in 2005, we have the Vienna Memorandum on World Heritage and Contemporary Architecture, managing the historic urban landscape. And that's the kind of key term I'm picking up here, because the historic urban landscape becomes UNESCO's way to try and think about what it means to manage a site at an urban scale. It's all very well thinking about, I don't know, somewhere like the academical village here. I mean, it's kind of quite a discrete thing. You can think how to manage that in a way quite easily. How do you think about managing a site which is a whole city, or a whole chunk of a city? So this is the beginning of UNESCO seeking to do that. It leads forward to the 2011 UNESCO recommendation on the historic urban landscape. And now this is all, I think, when this is happening in UNESCO, as I understand it, it was a bit of an internecine warfare going in within UNESCO between, if you like, what we can call a sort of traditionalist camp, who's saying, no, it's all preservation. It doesn't matter that it's 20,000 buildings, it's preservation on the one hand, and what we might call the kind of modernizers on the other side, were saying, come on, we have to think about this differently. Cities do change. You cannot take a kind of hardline preservationist approach at a kind of urban scale. We need a mechanism for addressing it. Those kind of modernizers win out in the end, or at least in this particular avenue of UNESCO activity, they win out, and it leads to this recommendation, the historic urban landscape, which, as I read it, is really a planning process. I mean, that's what it is for me. It's an effort to integrate looking after cultural heritage into urban planning processes, and accepting that cultural heritage management sits alongside other policy objectives and wider governance processes, including sort of processes of democratic engagement, for example. So it's an attempt to kind of place a sort of cultural heritage management within that kind of wider frame of urban management. It's still very much with us. This is a cover of a UNESCO report from 2022, which reinstates the case for historic urban landscape in the context of UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals. It then goes on to say, but it's not really working because we've got all these problems of governance, policy, inventory, inclusion, blah, blah, blah. But it is still very much an objective of UNESCO. Now, the other thing, just to say briefly at this point, is I have to say this has been completely invisible, more or less, within the UK. You find no reference to historic urban landscape within planning policy. You find no reference to it into sort of kind of discussions and debates about heritage issues. So it's kind of out there, but you do not see it being operationalized in my country, I would suggest. Okay, back to the UK. So this wave of development pressure, which is occurring early in the century, and then shuddered to a halt in 2008. This kind of wave of development pressure was evident in many British cities, and caused issues with those World Heritage sites which sit in cities or are big chunks of cities, triggering a whole series of processes, and particularly what UNESCO was doing quite a lot at that time was sending a monitoring mission to kind of come and have a look and report back, sending monitoring missions to a bunch of different British sites, to a bunch of different cities. So, just very briefly, on the left here, we have Bath. Now, there's a peculiarity about Bath, that when the Bath was inscribed as World Heritage Site in the 1980s as part of that kind of first wave of inscription of sites, there was no boundary. There was literally no boundary was included. So de facto, they kind of used the boundary of they used the city boundary of that time. It's since changed, but they used the city boundary of that time as a sort of de facto boundary for the World Heritage Sites, and that eventually was kind of formalized and became the boundary for Bath. But it was a bit crazy because that boundary is very big. It includes all sorts of former industrial sites, it includes all sorts of kind of suburban developments, which really have no right being within this World Heritage Site, which of course is ultimately to do perhaps most famously with the 18th century development of Bath, of the sort of grand Georgian developments, which made it, a super fashionable and important resort place to go and take the waters and feel better. And also the sort of old and more ancient city which sits alongside that, back to the Roman baths, which gave the city its name. So it's got this very big boundary, and it means that all these development proposals are coming forward, such as the one which is pictured under number 4 here. This is a page of the management plan for the World Heritage Site. And it's illustrating a development called Bath Western Riverside. And Bath Western Riverside is on a big former industrial site. And UNESCO found itself being kind of drawn into sort of debates about this, which really I don't think were necessarily that appropriate, that helpful for UNESCO to be that involved. And one of the issues I think with UNESCO generally is faced is that sometimes it's kind of been dragged into these debates. People within cities who don't like what's going on or what's being proposed will write to UNESCO and say, this is outrageous, you must come and do something about this. So Bath was one site, was one place that UNESCO were looking at. Another place UNESCO were looking at was Edinburgh. Perhaps a little bit more kind of substance to what was going on in Edinburgh. There's quite a lot of development going on, which evoked controversy in the city. There's quite a lot of development happening around the kind of periphery of the principal World Heritage Site, which is impacting particularly on the views and on the kind of skyline of the city. You have got UNESCO being drawn in and asked to kind of comment, coming and visiting, writing reports about Edinburgh. And one of the things that leads to in Edinburgh is kind of quite a common response, I think, in the UK, is that UNESCO, we're concerned about the skyline. So Edinburgh, okay, we'll write a policy about the skyline. So you just hear a little clip down here about the skyline policy. So we'll write a policy. And then you kind of see some of the things, a little bit of what's happened. So the picture, that kind of golden spiral, is a new shopping centre. I mean, it would have been a lot more contentious if it hadn't been replacing a 1960s kind of concrete shopping centre, which literally nobody loved. I really liked some concrete buildings, and I really didn't like that. So the kind of new St James Centre kind of got through, but in turn is hated by some for its impact on the skyline. It's got a very kind of scatological nickname, which I won't go into. And more contentious still, I think, was some of the development happening in London, around the various London World Heritage Sites. But I'm just picked up on the kind of right-hand side of the slide here, the Tower of London. So Tower of London, ancient kind of, castle and kind of fortification at the heart of the city of London. On the top right-hand slide, you just about kind of see it in the foreground. It's not a very good resolution picture. And then you kind of, you see how the skyline has developed and changed. Most of that's, how old were the oldest of those? The Norman Foster's Gherkin, the kind of cigar-shaped building, would be the oldest of those, and that's probably about 20 years old now. And the other buildings are newer, and there's probably more since actually this picture was taken. So what that does to the setting of the Tower of London, and whether it makes this kind of impressive fortress a sort of a bit of a kind of doll-like fortress in the kind of context of this surrounding urban development on both sides of the river, just showing one side of the river here, is very much in UNESCO's minds, and they're kind of writing kind of grumpy reports about that. So what you can see, I'll talk about the other side of the picture in a second, but what you can see to a greater or lesser extent in all of these cases is a clash of values. I'd say between UNESCO seeking to protect the historic monument, at times I think, certainly observing the UK cases, with at times an unrealistic view of the kind of stasis that might be achieved in major cities. I mean, they often, for example, say, we don't want any development until we sort this issue out. Well, I mean, that's just not a realistic position to take in London. You can't say we're not having any development for 5 years. It's just not a sort of a position which is gonna. It's just not going to happen. So the UNESCO on the one hand, local politicians generally on the other hand, keen to promote growth, capture economic development. And then, of course, various other actors do get involved, muddy the waters a little bit. So, as I said, there's kind of quite often local conservationists unhappy with change, seeking to kind of mobilise UNESCO on their side of the argument to support the case. And in the middle of all this, we have a kind of planning system, sometimes with direct interventions from central government. So most planning is administered at a local government level, but central government can intervene. I'll come back to that. So mostly at local level, sometimes with central government intervention, trying to kind of mediate and reconcile between these kind of competing demands. Now the pictures on the left are of Manchester. Now Manchester was on the tentative list of World Heritage Sites. So when this kind of rationing came in, countries had to produce a tentative list of potential future sites. And on the first version of UK's tentative list, Manchester was included. Because in this case of its position as a kind of key locale in early developments around transport technology, Manchester was one end really of the first passenger railway in the world between Manchester and Liverpool. The original station building is still there. Also other transport technologies, canals, as you can see here. So it was really very much a kind of transport focused nomination, potentially. However, when development proposals came forward for a lot of development in this part of Manchester, there's kind of a development boom happening, and particularly for building tall. And the very first of these proposals is the building on the picture on the left here called the Beetham Tower, the first really new high building in Manchester. When proposals like that came forward, Manchester was faced with a choice because they were told basically if you approve this, you will lose your place on the tentative list of World Heritage Sites. You're kind of killing your World Heritage Site proposal, which you've come forward with and you've advocated for. And that's the decision Manchester took. It said, well, if that's the choice, we'd rather have both, but if that's the choice, we'll have the Beetham Tower and forget about the World Heritage Site. And then that's a picture I took from a train going through Manchester a couple of weeks ago, and you can see there's lots more high-rise buildings followed behind that first one. Okay, right, on to Liverpool. So this is Liverpool, bird's eye view, 1851, busy working port, sea in the far distance. This is a little bit more about the history of Liverpool. So there's a whole history of the development of a very extensive complex of docks. What we have on the left is the earlier docks, and this, if we put them side by side, this would be at the south, and then on the right we have the sort of north, going towards the sea, going further down the River Mersey, and successively developing further out away from the city centre through till you might just about read at the top there, Seaforth 1972. So there's a very extensive kind of complex of docks. It's a history of continuous change and growth, through this long history as a sort of productive docklands. Change is constant. And a lot of very different kind of series of dockland development. In the pictures we have, in the middle here, we have a sort of early surviving example of a kind of dock, kind of complex of a warehouse on the left, and the merchant's house on the right. So at this point, the merchant feels the need to be on site next to their valuable warehouse. As sort of it becomes more of a bigger industrial process, the docks get enormous, like Stanley Dock here on the left, and the merchants move way out of town, well away from the nasty, dirty, smelly docklands, but they're kind of feeling sufficiently confident about the security of docks by that point. From the aerial, we have Albert Dock in the foreground, which is perhaps the most kind of iconic dock complex, very close to the city centre, which is just off to the right. Where that splodges of green are is Pier Head, where the so-called Three Graces are, the kind of public front of Liverpool to the River Mersey, because most of this dockland is sealed off. It's behind a high wall. It's a space you never access unless you happen to work or have other good reason to kind of go there. The only place historically you would access the river until really the 1980s is where that green is, where you might go and catch a ferry to the other side of the river in modern times, a bigger ferry perhaps in older times, and where there's a kind of public face to the river. This is the Albert Dock, which I was talking about. So as the modern docks up the Mersey continued to prosper, the older, smaller central docks towards the city centre just became either low-grade use or gradually falling into disuse. So in the case of the Albert Dock here, it received some wartime damage from a stray bomb or from a bomb. This is it 20 years later, probably. Nobody's bothered repairing it. In the top picture, you can see nobody's bothered really maintaining clear water. There's a very narrow kind of channel into the dock, and it's just been allowed to silt up. And you can see, get the feeling of something which is really kind of quite dilapidated. Now, in the 1980s, waterfronts really became the major focus of public regeneration policy in the UK, borrowing really from US models like Baltimore. The focus of the kind of government-created development corporations at the time, which are aimed at stimulating market investment, with a kind of brief to achieve physical regeneration and development. Merseyside Development Corporation in Liverpool and surrounding areas won the first two of these, and the landmark project for the Merseyside Development Corporation, Merseyside Dockland Development Corporation, was the regeneration of Albert Dock. This was their number one goal, because they could saw the potential in the kind of quality of the buildings. They saw the potential in the location close by the city centre, and so they kind of worked on this, threw a lot of money at it, and it was successful. This is my picture from quite a long time ago, but much later than that, obviously, where the dock had been refurbished. It's got major museums, and it's got an international slavery museum, for example. It's got restaurants, cafes, shopping, offices, hotel, TV studios, market apartments, and so on. So this regeneration project was a kind of critical catalyst in the regeneration of central Liverpool, raising belief and expectation of what was achievable and connecting the city with the kind of previously walled off docks. However, this happened in the mid-80s, and then development stalled for a long time. And it was only really in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, that a kind of new wave of regeneration started to happen. Actually, as it happens, quite a lot of this happening with European money, ironically. So anyways, we'll jump forward to this time, World Heritage Site nomination, and Liverpool was inscribed as Liverpool Maritime Mercantile City in 2004. And this is in recognition of Liverpool's historic significance as an outstanding example of a world mercantile port city. So in the 18th, 19th century, as I talked about with a class in here this morning, Liverpool was central to the expansion of the British Empire, in particular to the transatlantic slave trade, and the emigration of peoples from Britain, but also across Europe, from the Old World to the New World in the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century in particular. Its role as a major world port gave impetus for technological developments and generated wealth for some magnificent buildings. So World Heritage Site status was effectively part of a process of cultural reinvention. And this went alongside a load of other activity, and probably more important to Liverpool, I think, was becoming European capital of culture for 2008. But it's one part of our process of trying to create a whole new narrative for the city. The boundary of the site, this is the boundary of the site. Sort of, you can see it's mostly drawn around docklands, but kicks inward to take, this is a major part of the city centre. It's another bit, the sort of periphery of the city centre. So that's the major, the boundary site, and then the blue line is what's called the buffer zone. Now, it was apparent at the time of nomination that extensive development was both anticipated and seen as desirable by the various UK authorities. So the World Heritage Site was an accolade in itself, but it was also a means to an end. It's about helping achieve that regeneration of the city. Because, I mean, something I skipped over a little bit is that, Liverpool after that kind of glory years, the 18th, 19th, early 20th century, went into decline and then went into sharp decline. When I was growing up, not so far away in the 1970s, Liverpool was really a synonym for depopulation, decline, deindustrialization, crime, poverty, you name it. Liverpool had all these associations. So kind of getting something like a World Heritage Site, getting European capital culture is all kind of part of representing itself to the world. A newer and far more kind of positive image than the one which it acquired over the kind of preceding decades. But this wish for a load of new development was a source of friction with UNESCO from the get-go, from the outset. And this here is also from the kind of time of the nomination. If you looked at the kind of detail of this, which we don't have time for now, but you'd see there's a lot of implicit development within here. And then if you just have a look at these, you get that flavour again. So, I mean, at the time of the inscription, I think the World Heritage Site attracted a lot of support from many agents, government bodies, the people involved in the management and the regeneration of Liverpool. But there was always concern, particularly from the business community, that it could stifle investment. And a lot of investment was happening. So on the left is a map from 2008 showing active development projects at that time. The map on the right is rather later, I think it's 2017, again showing in relation to the World Heritage Site a whole series of sort of development projects kind of going on or completed. But this was always a kind of fraught relationship with the UNESCO really from the beginning. Tensions first emerged at the heart of the site, the symbolic heart of the site, Pier Head, where these three grand early 20th century buildings, the so-called Three Graces, sit. Because, well, firstly, there was a kind of proposal for a so-called Fourth Grace. I'm not sure I'd call that graceful, but that was by Will Alsop, the now departed Will Alsop. But it was branded as Fourth Grace. It was a bit of a fantasy, and it kind of disappeared. That's the development which ultimately happened on that site. But at the same time, that was coming forward. Man Island. We had a new museum for Liverpool, which UNESCO wasn't happy with because it sat forward and in the sort of development line of these Three Graces, albeit it's on the line of a lot of the Dockland buildings. And then this, which is a bit of a shocker, admittedly, the new ferry terminal building was happening at the time. So UNESCO was sending esteemed experts to kind of come and look at these and kind of comment on them, and they weren't happy. But in the end, they accepted them, and in the end, things kind of died down a little bit. They accepted that whilst they didn't really like them, that they weren't ultimately challenging the integrity of the site or the outstanding universal value of the site. However, we then got this proposal. This is a proposal, or now being enacted, a scheme called Liverpool Waters, a huge waterfront redevelopment scheme. One company basically had managed to assemble all this land. The developers have talked about it in terms of a kind of 50-year implementation period. Plans were first unveiled in 2007. Planning application made in 2010. An outline planning consent granted by the City Council in 2012. And this is a really odd thing, because this is in a World Heritage Site, at least partly, and normally you don't grant outline planning permission in places of sort of sensitivity. You require a kind of full application with all the details, whereas this was granted with very little detail. And it was also granted without the government exercising its right to bring in what's called call it in and subject this proposal to a public inquiry, which again you would have pretty much expected was something of this significant. Something which really provoked a lot of concern in the heritage sector, not least as its own advisors, English Heritage, had commissioned a very detailed and very critical evaluation of Liverpool Water's proposals. And, all sorts of other people were vociferous in their opposition. And I think this is a kind of key moment in this whole kind of story of Liverpool World Heritage Site and its loss. I think that one act of the government deciding not to call this proposal in set a whole series of events in motion which it was very difficult to kind of recover from. UNESCO placed Liverpool World Heritage Site on its danger list in June 2012. Now, a lot did happen after that. So these early visions for Liverpool waters were pretty alarming. These clusters of decontextualised high-rise buildings. And a lot was subsequently done to modify the scheme and develop proposals that showed greater cognizance, really, for the specifics and the kind of qualities of Liverpool. So we had a whole series of kind of policy developments. This actually predates Liverpool Waters, this supplementary planning document, as it's called, but a whole series. This is just a sample of documents which were kind of prepared during this period for either particular parts or for the whole site, all part of trying to kind of respond to UNESCO, all trying to part of recover from this position of being put on the danger list, all part of trying to kind of get into a different position with UNESCO, whilst at the same time with no possibility of doing what UNESCO would like, which is to revoke the planning permission which is being granted. Because revoking that planning permission, A, they didn't want to do it, and B, if they had done it, it would cost them many, many millions of pounds. So it was not going to happen. So they're trying to look for a way back which doesn't involve revoking that planning permission. And, with some success, I'd have to say. I mean, Liverpool Waters today, it's happening, but it's a very different proposal from those early rather crazy illustrations. Fewer tall buildings, general reduction in height of buildings, more thoughtful in terms of how it kind of presents to river views, more thoughtful in terms of how it's arranged and the disposition of massing within the site. The removal of underground parking, which was impacting on the sort of kind of archaeology of the docklands. It's a much improved and much more careful scheme. However, this proposal then came forward. This is now being built. This is a football stadium for the Everton Premier League football, or should I say, soccer team, now on site. It does, I think, partly build over one of the historic docks. And it seems to have been a bit of a final straw for UNESCO. I mean, Liverpool have been sitting on this danger list for a long time. Anyway, this happened. Cue more kind of concern from UNESCO. And then we get to the World Heritage Committee of 2021, this is the committee which deleted Liverpool from the World Heritage List. Don't need to kind of go through all the detail of this. But the point generally is that the World Heritage Committee acknowledged that a lot of beneficial work had been done in Liverpool. But they considered that key things were undone. And that the decision was taken that Liverpool was deleted. Now, maybe a little bit later in discussion, we could talk a little bit more about what went on then. But it doesn't matter in a way. I mean, the net consequences, it was deleted from the World Heritage List. And one thing which I would just want to come back to very briefly, in none of this is there any reference to historic urban landscape, which does make me wonder what the heck the purpose of historic urban landscape is, which UNESCO's got this recommendation on, which produces reports on. If you get into a decision on the transformation of an urban World Heritage Site like this, and nobody's talking about historic urban landscape. So, there we go. Liverpool loses its stripped of UNESCO World Heritage Site status from the BBC, so it must be true. Right, I'm nearly done. So, a focus on public-supported, market-dictated regeneration of ports and waterfronts has been a central characteristic of UK urban policy for over 40 years. The role of heritage in this process, I think, has been a bit ambiguous, important as a frame for new development, helpful for constructing place quality, but sometimes seen as a restraint on development or as a history that's in need of sanitisation. I think the visual signifiers, indicators of former maritime uses, are often highly prized as part of an aestheticised signifier of former uses. Things like railings, cranes and so on become an important part of the ambience of the new place. A bit more problematic is the recycling of large industrial structures. Sometimes, such as with Albert Dock, they become a focal point for regeneration efforts. But their scale, their typological characteristics, method of construction, floor-to-ceiling heights, depth of floor plan, all these things can make them difficult and expensive structures to reuse. Nevertheless, for the most part, they are protected by listing, and there is an acceptance that they should be retained. Sometimes they mysteriously catch fire, but more or less they're retained. Beyond the direct heritage implications, there's a strong imperative to capture development in all locales, but understandably, perhaps, particularly in economically deprived places. Some of the places next to where we're talking about in Liverpool would be some of the poorest places in Europe. I mean, they're talking about some super deprived communities. We can question how much they might actually benefit from something like Liverpool waters, but you can see there's a kind of political imperative to accept what's on the table and do something about that. Now, in this specific context, and I shouldn't overgeneralise, I mean, there is this strong legal framework in the UK, there is a strong policy framework, but in situations like this, situations kind of, key locales of economic activity, or which are seen to have that potential, the role of heritage, while significant, is in large part become to serve economic development goals. And I think that's something broadly accepted in principle by many of the actors involved, in a way which I don't think historically was quite the case. I think has become kind of institutionalised. Liverpool, I think, is in many respects a typical British example. However, what makes it different is the involvement of UNESCO, which shines a very different light on the debate. An outside body presenting a very different vision of the role and appropriate management of heritage, perhaps more from that kind of traditionalist wing of UNESCO that I talked about. The conclusion for Liverpool, sadly, was the loss of its World Heritage Site status. From a distance, it seems to be something of a debacle that brings credit to no one, really, and where both the various UK authorities and UNESCO have some culpability. In Liverpool, the economic promises, however illusory, of a multi-million-pound investment were always likely impossible to refuse. And I've talked about the kind of communities which sit alongside there. Added to this was the reluctance of the state power, the UK government, to use its power to become directly embroiled in the dispute, really sidestepping, I think, the responsibility which it had. I think a kind of critical moment in this story. At the same time, it surprises me how little acknowledgement UNESCO gave to the very significant efforts to try and fix the situation, both in terms of the evolution of Liverpool waters, but also in the really very significant conservation efforts elsewhere in the city that Liverpool has made over the last 10, 15 years, including all those kind of policy documents which I talked about. UNESCO has given a huge amount of weight to ascribe permissions yet to be implemented. Some probably never will be implemented. And the demand for a moratorium on development was just totally unrealistic in a major city. And again, just reference this lack of reference from UNESCO and others to historic urban landscape in really understanding what's happening with the outstanding universal value of the city. So as a result, we got into a situation where something had to give, and unfortunately for Liverpool, that something was Liverpool's World Heritage Site status. So we're back to the beginning to recap very briefly. The UK, England has this very extensive system of heritage protection. It carries a very significant policy weight, certainly, in a way very different from the way I understand things happen here. It's incrementally developed, and that means it's sort of never really built in a real understanding of sort of international mechanisms and things which the UK subscribes to, various charters and so on, but then doesn't incorporate directly into its law and policy. It's a flexible and discretionary system, which does, which is very different from some of the other European countries, for example. I mean, if we were talking about these sorts of issues in France, for example, we'd be having a very different kind of conversation. It's not well resourced. It's expected to work with other policy goals, and it's become institutionalized as part of that it really should support economic policy in these kind of spheres of economic activity. And I think there is a little bit more willingness, again, through my working career, which is quite a long one now, the balance has shifted. The economic goals have become more important, particularly in these last 15 years, particularly after 2010, particularly after kind of public sector austerity, particularly after the kind of changes and the evisceration we've seen in my own country of the local state and local government. So that's where Liverpool found itself. It saw these factors, all operating with Liverpool, and that led to a clash with UNESCO, and that led to the loss of the World Heritage Site status. And with that, I think I should shut up. Thank you very much.